Good morning, folks. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the California ISO Stakeholder Call to discuss the Storage Default Energy Bid, or DEB, Draft Final Proposal as part of the Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources Initiative, recently spun off from the Phase 4 proposal. As you may know, this DEB piece is now targeting a separate board date in December from that of Phase 4, with Phase 4 proposal going to this month's board next week, as you also may know. Which we, of course, thank you again for your engagement to date during all that is going on, of course, with the current events out there. Our today's agenda, as you can see, will, of course, be to discuss the proposed storage DEB formation, followed by updates to the day-ahead DEB proposal. And then lastly, before we conclude, we'll address the exemption for small storage resources. And leading our presentation for today will be the lead for this topic, Gabe Murtaugh from our Market and Infrastructure Development Policy Group. Also from that group, we're joined by John Gooden and Bridget Sparks. We're also joined by Bill Weaver from our legal group, as well as Bob Cott from our Regional Operations Initiatives Group, Greg Ford from our Power Systems Technology Development Group, Kevin Head and Katie Wickler from our Market Analysis and Forecasting Group. This, of course, as you may know, is a simple display of our stakeholder process throughout which the ISO obtains input from stakeholders in between each proposal iteration prior to carrying it forth to the board for consideration for approval. And again, we appreciate your engagement to date. In addition, calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. And of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And lastly, of course, if you have any questions, we ask that you please raise your hand virtually by pressing #2. We do prefer verbal questions only. But I will be watching out for the chat in case anyone feels they want to write a chat question, and I can verbalize it for you. And of course, we ask that you please state your name and the company that you represent. And with that, I'll hand it over to Gabe.
Thank you, Jimmy. Good morning to everybody who's out there. I hope folks are staying safe and healthy during these times, and we do appreciate you continuing to support this stakeholder initiative and contribute with stakeholder comments and interactive discussions like these. As Jimmy noted, this is or was a component of the Esder 4 stakeholder initiative. The timeline that we have or showing here on page 4 of our slide deck indicates sort of where we were going with that initiative. We had our Esder 4 final proposal published on August 21st. Generally, the final proposal is the last milestone before the ISO goes to the EIM governing body and the Board of Governors meetings to get final approval within the ISO to move forward with any particular proposal. This specific piece of policy did garner an MSC opinion, which was published on September 8th, which you'll notice was after the publication of the Esder 4 final proposal. Within that opinion that was published by our Market Surveillance Committee, we did see quite a few changes or potential changes that could be imposed on the policy that we had written in Esder 4, and we think that a few, or two specifically, items that were mentioned by the MSC were worthy of further consideration. Again, generally, we wouldn't, continue a stakeholder initiative beyond that final proposal, but we did think that as we have had heavy discussion with the Market Surveillance Committee on this particular topic, and it's something that's new and of interest to a lot of different parties, we believe that it was prudent in this case to continue our stakeholder initiative in developing policy specifically around the storage default energy bid and specific to these two items that we think are worth addressing from the MSC opinion in this timeline here that we've outlined. So I've also indicated on September 15th, we did post the draft final proposal, or what we're calling the draft final proposal for the Esder default energy bid. Again, it's just that Esder storage default energy bid component of the Esder 4 initiative. Today is September 22nd, and we are indeed having a stakeholder meeting to discuss that draft final proposal. And again, today I'm intending just to talk about the MSC opinion. We'll do a very small amount of brief background into the Esder 4 storage default energy bid, and then we can have some discussion on the topics, as Jimmy announced, that we're proposing through this draft final proposal, and take any questions and feedback there. My intent, even though we do have a agenda that goes through noon today, is to finish significantly before noon. I don't anticipate this discussion would take the full 2 hours. With that said, and again, Jimmy indicated this, we are going to the Board of Governors with all of the Esder 4 topics, excluding the storage default energy bid, on the September 30th, October 1st board date that's coming up. And then in October, we will be posting a final proposal for this Esder DEB. So this will be a final proposal that will either include these 2 items that are outlined from the MSC opinion, or will not include those 2 items, or some combination of either one. And then we will be taking this Esder default energy bid to the EIM governing body at the beginning of December, and then in mid-December, we will go to the Board of Governors for final approval to move forward with this. Now, typically we do have release dates that are independent for each of the projects that we work on. We have already been in discussions with our technology team here at California ISO, and the intent is that all of the policy that was originally part of the Esder 4 initiative, which would include the items that are going to the Board of Governors this month, and this specific item that's going to the Board of Governors meeting in December, would all be completed still in the fall 2021 release, which is the same schedule that was included with the Esder 4 stakeholder initiative. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide. So this is slide 6. As I mentioned, I'll just be going through a very high-level overview of what has already been discussed in the Esder 4 initiative. And again, in the last few iterations of the paper, we haven't made significant changes to the storage default energy bid. Here, I'll just be running over the high-level outline of how this calculation works. And I'm not anticipating a ton of questions on this, since we have discussed this in a few stakeholder calls already, and a few times at quite great length. So part of the initial Esder 4 initiative was that we would begin applying default energy bids and market power mitigation to storage resources. We are still anticipating doing that and having that implemented online in our market at the start of the fall release for software in 2021 here in the California ISO. And the default energy bid, well, at the same time, we've offered a default energy bid for storage resources so that their costs can accurately be accounted for and captured. Essentially, this storage default energy bid has 3 components. It includes energy costs and losses, so round-trip efficiencies for storage resources. It includes cycling costs as the second component, and then finally it includes opportunity costs. We feel that all 3 of these components are critical in modeling most storage that's on our system. So when we're thinking about storage on our system, we're generally talking about lithium-ion storage. And again, we had a workshop last December where we talked a lot about storage resources and how to model those costs and interpret those costs. And I think sort of out of that workshop, we came up with the fundamentals of these 3 components really driving those costs. So in actually formulating the default energy bid, we're comparing the energy costs and the cycling costs against the opportunity costs, and we're taking the maximum of either of those 2 components, and we're multiplying that by 1.1. The idea there, and this is something that the ISO does for a number of other default energy bids, is that if there is some variability in how we're calculating any of the components of these costs, that hopefully that's picked up by a little bit of variation with the 1.1 multiplier. So the first component in the storage default energy bid is the estimation for the costs for the storage resource to buy energy. This calculation is actually a little bit complicated because for a 4-hour duration battery, what that means is the battery can discharge energy for a continuous period of 4 hours. It does not mean that it takes 4 hours for that battery to completely charge. Oftentimes, storage resources, lithium-ion storage resources, will have round-trip efficiencies of anywhere from 0.8 to 0.9, which means that if I, for example, if I charge 1 megawatt hour from the grid and pull that energy off the grid, I really only have the capability of providing something like 0.85 megawatt hours of energy at a later time. And then, ergo, if I'm charging for an hour, I would have less energy available if I'm producing at my max output and discharging for the full hour. I wouldn't have the full energy capability to do that. I'd only have 85% of that time period producing at full output, assuming that the resource had the same charging and discharging capabilities at either the minimum output or the maximum output of the resource. So both the energy duration, so typical lithium-ion batteries on our system right now are 4-hour energy duration, and the round-trip efficiencies, which again can range anywhere from below 0.8, so 80% or so, up to 90%, give or take, are considered in that estimate of how much cost there is to buy energy. There's also a rho value, which is a estimation of the variable cost of the resource. And again, there was quite a bit of discussion on how we should model variable costs in this default energy bid, and the actual inner workings and the chemistry of storage resources and how they work is relatively complicated. And to, actually model energy coming into the battery and energy going out of the battery and how that affects the life of the battery and, average or incremental costs to the battery are very, very complex. And you can model that through, a complex framework, or you could sort of take a step back and use expected, average incremental costs or, across what you're expecting to use the resource over the course of a year, and then periodically update that value. And that's sort of the direction that we've proposed to go. And again, this is something we talked about in our final proposal for Esder 4 and our draft final for Esder 4. So this, again, shouldn't be anything terribly new for folks who are listening in on the call. But essentially, the idea here with the default energy bid for storage resources is that you would think about the amount of cost to buy the energy. You think about the amount of costs to, of wear and tear on your resource. And if the price spread in your market, where you could buy prices at the low, or you could buy energy at the low prices and sell energy at the high prices, if that spread was sufficient to cover that combination of costs, then you would go ahead and do it, hence this default energy bid. Because these resources are limited in duration, like I said, most storage resources on our market are 4 hours of duration, it's also appropriate and necessary to consider opportunity costs, particularly in the real-time market. So if I know or if I anticipate that the peak 4 hours of energy prices are going to be at $100, even though energy might be $90 during this specific hour, it wouldn't be worthwhile or efficient for me to sell energy at $90 because I'm expecting higher prices in intervals later on in the day. So with the opportunity cost in place in any bidding or default energy bid that is used for a storage resource, essentially that prevents that from happening, and the resource wouldn't get discharged until those high prices actually occur in the real-time markets. But one other thing I would add is that the variable costs that we're anticipating collecting from storage resources, and this would be a number that upon agreeing on or negotiating a storage default energy bid with the ISO, there would need to be a consultation with the ISO, and various information would need to be verified through documentation would include this variable cost. And the variable cost value that the ISO would accept would be the upper range of what the expected variable cost would be. So, for example, the resource had an estimated variable cost for typical operations, and let's just say that variable cost was $30 per megawatt hour on what it would expect if it was cycling once per day, every single day for the entire 365 days a year. That's what the expected variable cost would be. If, however, that resource were pushed and actually operating at 2 cycles per day, which is potentially beyond what it was designed to do, but those costs were something like $60 per megawatt hour, that $60 per megawatt hour would be acceptable. The ISO is looking for sort of an upper bound on what costs would be for these storage resources. Then we would take that value and use it in the default energy bids that were calculated for that resource. Again, this was something that was discussed in regard to the ISO building a default energy bid that would be really workable for storage resources. We didn't want to underestimate what these costs would be, because in doing so, we might inadvertently have these resources discharging when their actual costs could be higher than the marginal costs that were estimated by the default energy bid, which would be a particularly bad outcome for storage resources, could cause additional and excess wear and tear, and something that would generally not be a good outcome. What this default energy bid does do, though, is it does prevent storage resources from exercising excessive amounts of market power. So storage resources, if they are pivotal in the market, they won't be able to bid in at prices of $1,000. Instead, they'd be mitigated to the storage default energy bid values, and that would set the price instead of something very, very high like $1,000. So we do think the ISO is still in a position that this is a reasonable approach for the default energy bid for storage resources, and we're continuing to stay with this approach for default energy bids until we get additional experience with how these resources work and understanding how these costs work. And then potentially in the future, if we want to sort of drill down and tighten up these bounds on the storage default energy bids, we may elect to do that. But for now, this is sort of our first pass at how we're going to do this. So moving on to the next slide, slide 7 here for those of you who are following along. The ISO does acknowledge, and this is sort of what I was just talking about, that the default energy bid is really a first step at the prevention of exercising market power. We are planning right now to apply this default energy bid to the entire bid curve. Mitigation will not decrease schedules or hours when downward market power is exerted. So storage resources do still have the ability to bid in at negative $150 if they feel that's appropriate. The negative $150 bids could potentially set prices in the downward direction if the ISO has excess generation on the system and has a market and feasibility. And essentially, these storage resources are absolutely needed to charge. The Department of Market Monitoring has brought up a number of concerns about the exercise of these kinds of market power. So I do think that the ISO will address this in future updates when we're thinking about the default energy bid. We're just not including this in this specific iteration of the default energy bid for storage resources. But this should be considered in the future because just like we don't want resources exercising market power in the upward direction and setting prices at $1,000, we also don't want resources setting prices arbitrarily at the negative $150 lower limit for bidding unless their actual costs are reflective of that negative $150. So we are thinking about how to do this in the future, but because this would imply some significant changes to the market power mitigation software that we have here at the ISO, it was decided in the Esder 4 initiative that this wouldn't be included as part of the scope. We're certainly not expanding the scope to include this right now in this iteration of the draft final proposal for just the storage default energy bid concern, and these changes are really just concerning the opinion of the Market Surveillance Committee. This is something, the third bullet here is something that the Market Surveillance Committee also noted. Our day-ahead market works very much in the way of sort of accommodating and thinking about bids in terms of the spreads in the market and the spreads of what's actually bid. So if prices in the actual market reveal a price spread of $50 and the resource is bidding in at a particular spread of $30, it really doesn't matter if the bottom of the actual spread is at 100 or if it's at 0, and it doesn't really matter if the spread for the bids is very high or very low either. The day-ahead market would actually schedule the storage resource to charge and discharge if those spreads that are bid in are met. This specific market power, I do think, speaks to a little bit of what we talked about in the second bullet with the downward market power mitigation, but there is no ability here to sort of cap the bids on either side. This is really only market power mitigation in the downward direction, or moving bid curves in the downward direction. It doesn't do any sort of looking at spreads or considering the negative or charging portion of the bid curve for storage resources. Again, something we may consider in the future. Actual energy prices aren't considered here. So if I'm thinking about the real-time market, I'm using estimations of what I think the real-time prices are going to be using day-ahead market prices. This is sort of the ISO's best guess at what energy prices are going to be. But if the resource, for whatever reason, were to charge energy at $100, and that $100 was actually a cost that the resource incurred, those values wouldn't be included in the default energy bids. The default energy bids will still be based on day-ahead prices that are used to sort of infer what the cheapest prices will be in the real-time market. So if those prices don't materialize, or the resource buys energy at sort of the quote-unquote wrong times of the day, then they could, they will be on the hook for buying and selling that energy. Additional discharge schedules in the day-ahead market during mitigated hours may imply additional charging earlier in the day. What this means is that if a resource is bidding into the day-ahead market and the resource is mitigated during evening hours in the day-ahead market, and the mitigation run implies that there would be additional discharge during a specific hour, let's just say hour 18, for example, what that new schedule may also imply is that there would also be a charge of energy for that resource earlier in the day. This is generally not, although it's not impossible, it's generally not a feature that our markets currently do when mitigating for gas resources. Typically, gas resources are scheduled during a particular hour or not, and if they are mitigated during a particular hour, it means that they're producing during that hour. It might mean, or mitigation might imply that those resources are available for dispatch, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there would be a schedule outside of that hour that mitigation actually occurs in. For storage resources, it's a little bit different because it does imply that, which can have impacts on other resources on the market as well. So just something to keep in mind. So as I noted, this is sort of a very high level, very quick background on where the ISO is with the storage default energy bid and what we proposed in the Esder 4 initiative with our final proposal there. We are not anticipating large changes to this framework. And for those of you who've read ahead, I will be going through the MSC recommendations in the next few slides, and then we're going to be going through the specific changes that we are thinking about asking for in this draft final proposal in the few slides after that. But right now, I'll pause for questions. If anybody has any questions on the current formulation for the storage default energy bids, and I just ask that we hold any additional questions on changes to that formulation until after we go through the material and the presentation. Operator, any questions?
We do have 2 questions on the line. As a reminder, pressing pound 2 will indicate you wish to ask a question. Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Good morning, Gabe. This is Elvis Svoboda from PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Alva. Go ahead.
Good. I had a couple of questions that came up, and especially because looking at your proposal, you've really discussed the most important thing that is going to remain in the day-ahead market, which is the cost-based portion of the default energy bid. One just general concern I have is that the charging cost is based on a 4-hour average versus it being essentially a marginal cost to charge for the next unit of generation, so that any case in which you're essentially doing more than a 4-hour cycle, you may be understating the cost of charging to the bidder. And that some of that concern also extends to scenarios which I think are equally likely, which are, number one, that you may have cases where resources charge like 1.5 times a day or even 2 times a day, as you've mentioned, and in that case, the average charging cost, even the average charging cost, let alone the marginal charging cost, is likely to be significantly higher, and that would need to be represented in the discharge bid somehow, as well as resources that might have a longer, like a 6-hour charging time. What are your plans for? I see this as a starting point, but what are your plans for having some flexibility to deal with these issues in the future? Because the alternative is going to be people are going to restrict their charging essentially because there's no real limits on that, and you're going to get less discharge than you want, except under high price, where high prices are being set by other resources.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. We do want to sort of, take stock of how storage resources are bidding as we get more of them on our system. As you're aware, right now we have about 550 megawatts of storage installed on the system. Next year, at the end of 2021, we're anticipating about 1,500 megawatts of storage on the system, and those numbers are going to continue to grow into 2022. So, we really do want to see where the pain points in this calculation are over the next year or so. We want to learn from that. And as we do, if we need to make enhancements or adjustments where things like, average energy costs instead of marginal energy costs would make a significant difference in the default energy bid, and it would make sense to include that in the formulation, and we can see that from the data that we have, I think we'd be more than willing to, sort of take on an initiative where we can make those changes. As it is very early times, and as we've spent a lot of time thinking about and developing this default energy bid, I think we want to sort of push it out there and see how effective it is, and then going from there, we can make improvements as needed.
Right.
Does that help at all?
That's good. Yeah, that's very helpful. It indicates you'll be looking at this as essentially dynamic in a sense that if you see issues coming up that lead to market participants, not essentially complaining about the results of this, then you'll be pretty responsive on that, which I think is good. The one other thing I wanted to suggest, at least, and this is consistent with what your proposal is, that you might want to think about trying to establish a default reasonable variable O&M cost, sort of based on your model of the 4-hour battery. It could be the thing about the variable O&M cost is a lot of it is as when you call it a battery degradation cost, you're really talking about maximizing the value of the battery over its lifetime. And so it's really, even though you call it you talk about chemistry and so forth, it's really an economic opportunity cost that's being embedded in that. And documentation of that could be could be an issue for some, at least for some participants. I think sort of establishing what you think is a reasonable level would especially when we think about like small batteries, I think would be a better than having every participant, come up with a number and then try to negotiate with you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you may know the ISO is currently undertaking an initiative right now to think about overhauling the variable O&M costs that are included in default energy bids for essentially non-storage resources today. I envision a similar process for storage resources happening in the future, where we do have experience with, maybe some smaller classes of lithium-ion resources and some larger classes of specific chemistries of lithium-ion resources. And we could go through and from the ISO's experience of what we've seen, we can come up with reasonableness bounds, and we can come up with specific values or threshold values where if a resource came to us and said, hey, look, these are my costs, we could say, yes, this falls within the threshold. We could go ahead and approve it. And I think that's fairly common with other resources that we deal with in the market. Just because, there's not very much information out there in the literature today, except for, very high-level thoughts about average costs. We don't really know what those are. So hopefully through the efforts that we're going to be doing over the next few years, as we integrate more storage resources and see more of this information on a resource-by-resource basis, that would give us sort of the bounds and the guidance to move forward with those kinds of policies in the future. But I agree. I think this is something we should be working towards.
Yeah, and I do think if you had a default variable O&M value of 0 as kind of your baseline, I think that would be a very bad starting point for this because, as you mentioned, the lithium-ion batteries have a 90% efficiency or so, and that can lead to very low arbitrages being, taken in the market. Essentially, if you even a $5 arbitrage might end up being taken in the market, and that could be a very adverse outcome for battery operators.
Yeah, I agree, and I think just sort of the sanity check that we've done in the Esder 4 final draft of the paper, where we've done some sort of sample calculations of what we think some of these default energy bids might look like, and sort of resulting dispatch instructions that these resources could get in the real-time market. I think that shows that, we're not getting things like $0 spreads or even very, very small spreads. And if resources are, forthcoming and giving us the accurate information for this, they should be getting, reasonable and even on the upper bound of reasonable default energy bids in the market, and they shouldn't be dispatched all the time. But I think your concern is well-founded, because if we were doing something like that where spreads were very small and these storage resources were discharged quite often, that could really put us in a bind in terms of overusing the storage resources and,
That's right.
in the future not having them around when we needed them because, they needed cell augmentation or maintenance or something like that, or just too expensive to stay on the market.
Yeah, you might want to look at some of the production simulations, kind of studies that have been done and set a baseline on that. But,
yeah, if you have those and want to send those to me, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll see if we can. I think there's been quite a bit done in the public sphere on those kinds of heard numbers like $10 and $15. And I don't know if that's accurate, but I think those are coming out of production simulation studies.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Alva.
Thank you.
Okay, operator, next question, please.
Caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead. Caller, your line is now been unmuted. Go ahead.
Good morning. This is Tanya Doran with the Energy Division. How are you?
Hey, Tanya.
Hi.
Well.
Thank you. I wanted to say thank you for doing this deep dive on the formula. There's been questions I wanted to ask about the variable cost component. I understand now that it includes the cost to cycle a second time. And what I took away from the MS opinion is that they also agree that there is, extreme cost when, or more, additional cost when energy storage cycles deeply. And so I'm wondering if the variable cost component considers cycle depth along with whether it's a second cycle.
Yeah, it really doesn't consider cycle depth per se. I think a lot of the early discussions we had around, potentially calculating these variable costs did specifically include, cycle depth and the relationship between cycle depth and how much cost the resource was incurring. I think we've sort of stepped away and abstracted away a little bit from that in this derivation. But again, the ISO is willing to accept a variable cost that's inclusive of sort of the upper bound of what a resource operator or scheduling coordinator would think their cost would be. So, this could be something like, we anticipate that on a day-to-day basis, the resource during typical operations would be doing, 1.0 cycles per day, and that cycle would be particularly deep. So it would charge for 4 hours during peak solar hours, and then it would discharge for 4 hours during peak net load hours. However, the resource is capable of producing, let's just say, for example, 2.0 cycles per day. And if we did that, and we assume that those 2 cycles per day were particularly deep, you could charge during the middle of the night, hour ending 1, 2, 3, 4, discharge during hours 6, 7, 8, 9, charge again during the peak solar hours, discharge during the evening peak net load hours, and call that your 2 cycles per day. Both of those would be very deep because you'd be using all 100% of your state of charge from 0% state of charge to full state of charge. And those costs would be appropriate to include in this storage default energy bid. Again, it would be the upper bound of what those 2.0 cycles could be, because if you're doing 2 cycles of very shallow costs, those costs would or very shallow cycles, those costs would be significantly less. So we'd err on the side of caution and use that upper bound. Does that help?
So I'm wondering. Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. You're compensating them on the higher end, both for the second cycle and for deep cycling, so they would be covered on both fronts with this and allowed to say, this is what my highest cost could be. It seems like not so refined a tool, and just want to carry forward. In the next stakeholder initiative on this topic that, continue to refine the DEB so it considers cycle depth.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent point. I think the ISO is aligned with you in that as well. The closer we can model these costs, the better default energy bid we can get. I do tend to think that what we're doing right now is sort of an appropriate first step. We want to get some market power mitigation in place. This is sort of, like we're saying, an upper bound on what that could be. And in the future, we want to sort of ratchet that down as we get more familiarity with how these resources are actually working and what their costs really are. But, I appreciate that, Kanya. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
Yep, appreciate it. Operator, anybody else on the phone right now?
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay. Let's go ahead to slide 9 then. This gets into the recommendations that we saw from the Market Surveillance Committee opinion. I would just say the conversations that the ISO had with the Market Surveillance Committee were relatively lengthy. We had many conversations sort of offline with the Market Surveillance Committee, thinking about costs of storage resources, thinking about how our market worked in the day-ahead market framework and how resources were actually scheduled, thinking a lot about how that spread bidding functionality actually worked and what kinds of outcomes you might get from that functionality to storage resources. We had also had a number of discussions with Market Surveillance Committee in public forums as well. I think we ended up meeting with them 4 times to discuss the storage default energy bid, and we did have, some lengthy discussions on how, these costs for storage resources were actually formulated, what those kinds of things like we were just talking about, the relationship between cycle depth and costs to operate storage resources. So there was a lot of that and a lot of back and forth with the MSC. However, I think a lot of their formal opinion, which was written and published again after the final draft was posted for the Esder 4 initiative, a lot of that was sort of centered around their hard and fast suggestions on what we do to improve our formulation. And I think from that opinion, which really hadn't been expressed in, a lot of those phone calls that we had back and forth in the public meetings, there really were some good suggestions and some things we want to follow up on. So in summary, I think there are 2 improvements that we would like to make and implement for our default energy bid, and these are changes we'd like to move forward with the implementation that we're thinking about in fall 2021. The first being, relatively more complicated than the second, and the first is, I'm sorry, the other way around. The first is relatively straightforward. The second is slightly more complicated. But we would like to offer a sort of safe harbor for small storage resources and exempt them from being subject to the default energy bid. This is a recommendation that they made, and they also referenced some of the conversations that they had been having with the ISO and other forums, particularly the System Market Power Forum. But in thinking about this, we tend to agree a lot of the reasons that the MSC gave seem appropriate, and it might be worthwhile to go ahead and propose this. So we've done that here, and I will be talking about this change specifically in a few slides, but we think that this could be appropriate and wanted to raise it here. The second item is a change to the formula for the default energy bid, which would be applied to the day-ahead market. And essentially, they suggested not including the opportunity cost because of how the day-ahead market functions with the spread bidding functionality. We also thought this would be appropriate to pursue, and I've got a few slides sort of outlining how that would work in a few slides as well. So we'll go through that in just a minute. Before we do, though, I did want to sort of bring up a few of the other items that the MSC raised in their opinion. A lot of what they discussed in that document, and it was a very lengthy document, which I appreciated, which really did get into many of the details that we had discussed with them and sort of the nuances and the facets of the actual default energy bid that we had proposed. What they discussed quite often was in terms of how an ideal solution would work for a default energy bid for storage resources in the market framework that we have today. I think that the ideal solution is a valid place to start thinking about the default energy bids, even though that might not be appropriate for the actual proposal of a solution that might ultimately be implemented by any market operator. Ideal solutions often don't take into consideration market realities that we have to deal with, or shortcomings or things that aren't included in the market that really do impact costs for resources. So with that said, I think, but it does set a good backdrop for what we should be striving for and hopefully eventually achieving. And then I think the idea would be that any of those shortcomings you do have in your current market framework, those are accounted for in your default energy bid and sort of an augmentation of what that ideal solution that they propose would be. They did specifically say that prices should change or may, again, in an ideal scenario, should change based on state of charge for the resource. I think that that's appropriate. There's this idea that if a resource has a very low state of charge, then if they discharge a little bit more, that's likely worth more to them because then they have even less state of charge to perhaps discharge at a later time. I think this was something that the ISO has explored, and I think it's something that we could continue to think about in the future. Again, if it's something that's needed we'd likely adopt this in a later stage of the initiative. They'd also suggested pricing storage specifically. So if you could put a price on, and make, for example, an aggregate product of state of charge. So how much state of charge do you have on your system? You've got a supply of state of charge from all the resources. You've got a demand for state of charge, which could be set in some way, perhaps looking at future intervals. And then you could actually put a dollar per megawatt hour price on the value of state of charge. This could also interface with our end of hour parameters that we're using and allow resources a little bit more flexibility in specifying how much this energy is worth at any interval to them. The MSC proposed that storage resources not include charging costs in the default energy bids. They are, and I'm on slide 10 now, operator, thank you. But, they made this argument that, once energy is purchased by a storage resource, it's a sunk cost. I do think this is another one of those things, and in theory, this is a fine idea. I would also note that this is one of the things that we initially included in, I think, our issue paper and one of the very first iterations of our straw proposal, where we said, hey, we understand that charging costs do impact decisions for storage resources on whether or not they're going to buy energy and sell energy during the market. Does it make sense to include these storage costs in our default energy bid? And I think the feedback that we got from stakeholders in that portion of the initiative, which again was at the beginning of 2020, so quite a while ago at this point, I think we roundly heard that yes, those costs need to be included. So, even though this might be an ideal solution that the MSC is putting forward, it doesn't really seem to fit with the stakeholder policy that had already been discussed and agreed upon earlier. And I, don't feel particularly comfortable with walking back something like that where it had been discussed at quite length earlier on in this initiative. I also feel like, I do agree with the economic principles of sunk costs, but I also feel like the consideration for resources on our markets wouldn't really ever buy energy if there wasn't a opportunity to sell that energy at higher costs later on. And certainly, that cost is being considered when the energy is being bought. So, perhaps there's some additional thinking that needs to be done there. Again, I think if the ISO goes back to the drawing board and thinks about holistic changes to the default energy bid for storage resources, which I think is likely and something that we intend to do, we may consider, this piece of the policy again and think about how something like this would work. So in the future, we may pick up this discussion again, but I don't anticipate making any changes to accommodate this at this time. MSC also emphasized a need and they talked actually quite a bit about this in their opinion, but just the need for informing the ISO about what their energy is worth at the end of a horizon. So if you're thinking about the day-ahead market, that would be, hour ending 24 and what that state of charge would look like or what that state of charge is valued at the end of the 24-hour horizon. In the real-time market, if you're thinking about the RTD market, you're really looking out 65 minutes from wherever you're at right now and putting some kind of a value on that energy. Again, that could be related to your total state of charge. It could be related to how much state of charge is on the system in aggregate, but it might be something we consider in the future. I do think once you start incorporating things like this, you can make your model significantly more complex. I think one of the easiest solutions we could have is implementing that end-of-day state of charge parameter. But of course, there could be, and that was just a specific target state of charge that we considered in the Esder 4 initiative. But once you start including, prices and valuing that state of charge in the end-of-the-day horizon, it can get fairly complicated. So again, not something we're going to consider or pick up here in this very small sliver of an initiative, but something we may consider in the future. Operator, do we have any questions on the phone at this point before we move into the proposed changes that we are thinking about making?
As a reminder, pressing #2 will indicate you wish to ask a question. We have no questions at this time.
Perfect. So the two things that we're proposing here, so I'm on slide 12 for folks who are following along. The two things that we're proposing here are first, an update to the day-ahead default energy bid so that it does not include opportunity costs. This would not apply to the real-time default energy bid, and I was very careful about that in the paper. I know that there was some confusion in our earlier editions of the Esder 4 initiative where we were discussing this. So I specifically spelled out two formulas in the paper. One was the day-ahead formula and one was the real-time formula. But essentially the only difference between the two was that the day-ahead formula would no longer include opportunity costs. The idea here is that if there is a price spread that is sufficient to cover the variable cost of the resource and the cost to actually buy the energy that exists in the day-ahead market, because of the way that the optimization is set up, where it's a constrained cost minimization problem, where the actual engine that does the solution for that problem would understand that optimally to minimize those costs over the entire market, you would schedule your storage resource generally to charge during those lowest price hours of the day and to discharge during those highest price hours of the day. You really don't need to include the opportunity cost as an additional parameter. And I think, the MSC's argument here was that it could actually, distort the results of the day-ahead market. So I think we're inclined to move forward with this particular proposal. And I think the idea here would be that we would rely on our day-ahead market logic that was already built in to solve the model that we have. And I think this would be very much in line with what the MSC has proposed. The second idea that we're proposing here is to exclude small storage resources from being subject to the ISO market power mitigation tool. Again, this would be a simple yes or no flag. If the resource was small and there was one other condition met, that they weren't net supplier, that the ultimate parent of that resource wasn't a net supplier, then they would just simply be exempt from market power mitigation. So on slide 13, if we could advance one more slide, please. I've outlined what that day-ahead default energy bid formulation is. Again, there's no maximization here. There's no opportunity cost. It just is simply the energy cost for the resource, considering the duration of the battery and the round-trip efficiencies, and the variable costs or the estimated variable cost that would be supplied as the upper bound of what those costs were by the resource to the ISO, times that 1.1 multiplier, just to ensure that giving a little bit of cushion if our estimates are slightly off from one day to the next. Formulation, as I mentioned a number of times, doesn't include opportunity costs, and it's implicitly assumed by the day-ahead market software. And then we'd also assume that the day-ahead market schedules would be charging the resources when prices are low and discharging when prices are high, just by nature of how the market software arrives at its solution. And this shouldn't be a surprise to us. And then finally, the formulation does continue to consider the cost of the resource to charge, and it is going to include the variable cost for the resource to actually operate on the grid. So we are including both of those primary costs of what we think should be covered in the spread in the day-ahead market. And again, if prices don't materialize in the day-ahead market that are sufficient to cover the cost of buying the energy and the cost of cell degradation on the batteries, then the resource wouldn't be dispatched, and the market results would incorporate those costs, and the resource just simply wouldn't show up in the market. So that really is the summary of the first proposal that we've got. I'll go on the next slide is the summary of the second proposal, but I will pause for questions here if anybody has any thoughts on the day-ahead default energy bid formulation before we move forward.
We do have a question on the line.
Great.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hello, Gabe. This is Alva again. I think I've expressed this before, but I'm concerned about the possibility that the calculation of charging costs could go negative, and I think that would be a questionable result even if you're seeing negative prices, to essentially require that the default energy bid be at below the opportunity cost would tend to lead to bad outcomes. So just wanted to make that comment that I think there ought to be some explicit floor to your charging cost that doesn't go negative.
Interesting.
And I think that also impacts the use of, by the way, of the efficiency factor, because the efficiency factor goes in the wrong direction when you go negative. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's good feedback. So just to run that to ground a little bit, if we expected in our day-ahead market, let's say this was April, we had very high hydro season, the sun is expected to shine, and we are anticipating in our day-ahead market that prices are going to be negative $10, for example, for several hours during the middle of the day. If I had, a resource where I expected my marginal cost to charge energy and discharge energy to be about $30 per megawatt hour, I would find it advantageous to buy and sell energy as long as prices were higher than $20 per megawatt hour.
I agree with that principle.
Yeah. Okay.
I just think that if we're actually mitigating a bit, it should be based on probably on zero in that case. But,
okay. Well, let me think about that a little bit. I haven't really that hadn't really come up before, but I think that is a good point, and I'll consider that as we move to the final proposal list.
Thanks, Gabe.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, Alp. I appreciate it. Any other comments, operator?
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay. On slide 14, this is the final slide that I have. So if anybody has any comments or concerns about the entire presentation, then please feel free to raise your hand and we can discuss those. But the final piece that had been brought up by the Market Surveillance Committee was just that some of these small resources really do have very limited ability to exercise market power on across the ISO market, and hence the ISO would have very little benefit in going through the whole process of mitigating these very small storage resources. And they stress that there could be potentially high negative consequences for mitigation of the same resources, because we do have an environment today where the technology is rapidly changing. What is an appropriate default energy bid for storage resources today, which we've been discussing here, may not necessarily be an appropriate default energy bid for resources in the future, as that technology advances. So, being a little bit more cautious with very small resources that, again, have very little likelihood of having material impacts on our markets may be the way to go. And I think in light of the recommendation, the ISO is inclined to offer such a safe harbor. The idea would be that and this is the formal proposal here, the idea would be that any storage resource that was smaller than 5 megawatts in size and that had an ultimate parent that was not a net supplier on our market would be eligible to be just simply exempt from market power mitigation, and we wouldn't ever take any market power mitigation action against those resources. And that's essentially the proposal. It's very simple in a nutshell, and that's how we are anticipating to proceed with that. Operator, any questions now on the phone?
We do have 2 questions on the line.
Sure. Let's go ahead with those before I turn it over to Jimmy to wrap up.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, Gabe. Again, just a quick question. So basically, when ultimate parent, so essentially, if you have an aggregator of batteries where the aggregation was above 5 megawatts, would that essentially be a net supplier?
No. So I believe that the way that the ISO does a net supplier calculation for ultimate parents today. So this is relatively easy implementation for the ISO. But we do it when we're thinking about the pivotal supplier test. So this would be the same functionality we use today, and essentially it would look at the total load for any ultimate parent versus the total amount of generation for any ultimate parent, And if, quite simply, if the, load is greater than the generation, then the resource is, net load. Otherwise, it's a net supplier if generation is greater. So, the idea here would be if you've got a net supplier in the market, then they've got an incentive to sort of boost prices, and they could do that across their entire portfolio. So if they had thousands of 5-megawatt resources, we would want to mitigate those resources, whereas, a non-net supplier, so a net load, would really not have a lot of incentive to raise prices. And again, the 5-megawatt threshold for the resource wouldn't benefit a whole lot from that anyway.
Is that netting done within the hour? Is that?
No, I think it's actually done like on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis or something like that. So it just looks at average loads and average generations on a monthly or quarterly basis. Yeah.
So that would imply to me that any aggregation of batteries of that size would automatically escape market power mitigation, because obviously batteries charge more than they discharge. And so you could have participants who actually had quite a bit of market power, but in the form of aggregations of small batteries that would essentially evade the test by that means.
Oh, no, I think I'm not being clear here. So we would look at an ultimate parent level, and we would see, how much supply the ultimate parent had on the market, so how much generation they were actually offering in on average. And it might be the sum of like the P maxes of that generation. So just the capacity number. And then you'd look at average load that was served by that resource. So, if I have a whole lot of load and I only have one generator, and I'm counting on generators that are owned by, merchant generators or something to supply my load, then that would be somebody who is a net load entity. A net supplier would be somebody who owns a heck of a lot of generation but doesn't do any, load serving functions.
Wholesale charging is not
charging is not low. No.
Okay. Great.
No, it would just be like nameplate P-max.
So in general, if you're just a pure merchant aggregator of small batteries, you would in general, you'd get about 5 megawatts, and you would rise to the level where the default energy bit might be applied.
Yes. Yeah. It
Okay.
would be applied.
Great. Thanks.
Yep. Good question. Good clarification too. I appreciate that. Operator, did we have one more question?
Yes, we do. Caller, your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTS. I have a couple questions. Actually, my first question kind of continues on the discussion you just had. So I was curious as to kind of if you can elaborate a little bit more, the thinking behind why this net supplier versus net buyer distinction is needed. I'm just trying to figure out the difference between kind of, the MSC really talked about the negative consequences of mitigating smaller resources. So are the consequences different if that smaller resource belongs to a net supplier versus a net buyer? Or what was kind of the thinking behind having this additional qualification, I guess? Yeah, no, I don't think the consequences for the revenues for the individual resource would be any different. I think the, intention of a net supplier could be to exercise market power potentially, and they could potentially do that on, any resource that they have in their fleet. And if they have obviously more resources that are not mitigated, there could be more ability to exercise market power. And this was something that was discussed in the opinion as well. But, essentially this proposal that we have is exactly what the MSC recommended. So we are sort of following what they asked for. Okay, so if if a net supplier has a 5 megawatt battery, even though all of its other resources will be mitigated, that 5 megawatt will also be mitigated. But if it belonged to a net buyer, it would not.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay, I'll go back and reread the opinion to kind of better understand that justification. But my second question is, and maybe the 5 megawatt limit, do you have any, analysis around how many batteries today are 5 megawatts, kind of why 5 megawatts, where that number came from?
Yeah, that's a good point. The MSD opinion did not specify a specific megawatt value. They said, small resources, and I believe they even noted, for example, 5 megawatt resources. We haven't done, I know from experience from looking at the fleet that we have today that there are a number of resources that are very small, kind of fitting into this 5 megawatt bucket. But we haven't really done any explicit analysis on, what that cutoff could be. So, in the future, if we do see a lot of resources built right at, 5.0 megawatts or 4.99 megawatts or something like that, maybe that could be a reason or an argument to kind of circle back to this, say, are resources being specifically sized just to avoid, market power mitigation or not? But yeah, we haven't really zoomed in on why, a larger size or a smaller size might be more appropriate.
Okay, I appreciate that response. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Callie. I appreciate it. And operator, did we have any other questions in the queue at this time?
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay, I'll turn it back over to Jimmy Bashara.
Thank you, Gabe. Thanks, Marco, as well. And thanks, folks, again, for engagement with everything going on. Really appreciate all that. Great questions as well. Great work, Gabe. As you can see, we are asking for comments by October 6th. If you haven't yet registered for our new commenting tool, we ask that you please do. The link is right there. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to email myself at jbashara@kaito.com or ISO stakeholderaffairs@kaito.com. As mentioned, this was recorded, so you can look out for that, as you may know, in the next couple of business days. And once more, thank you, folks, and please have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conference Enhanced. You may now disconnect.